The longship was more than just a vessel, it was the technological marvel that transformed a collection of Scandinavian farmers into the most feared warriors and traders of medieval Europe. Without the longship, there would have been no Viking Age, no raids on distant monasteries, no settlements in Iceland, Greenland, or North America. The story of how these elegant, deadly ships changed the course of history begins not with violence, but with innovation on the shores of Scandinavia, where boat builders perfected a design that would dominate the seas for 3 centuries. The earliest ancestors of the Viking longship were simple dugout canoes carved from single tree trunks used by Scandinavian peoples for thousands of years. But around 200 BC, Scandinavian shipwrights began experimenting with a revolutionary new technique. They started building boats from overlapping planks of wood, a method called clinker construction. This technique allowed them to create larger, lighter vessels that could travel farther and faster than anything that had come before. The breakthrough came when they learned to split oak logs along the grain, rather than cutting across it, producing thin, flexible planks that could be bent into graceful curves. By the 4th century AD, Scandinavian boats had evolved into sophisticated vessels capable of crossing open water. The Nidum boat, discovered in a Danish bog and dating to around 320 AD, shows the level of craftsmanship already achieved. It was 23 meters long, powered by 15 pairs of oars, and built entirely without a sail, yet it could carry 45 warriors across the Baltic Sea. The Nidum boat demonstrated the key features that would define Viking shipbuilding for centuries to come. The overlapping planks were fastened with iron rivets. The hull was flexible enough to ride over waves rather than crash through them, and the shallow draft meant it could navigate rivers as easily as open ocean. The addition of the sail sometime in the 7th or 8th century transformed these coastal raiders into oceanic explorers. We don't know exactly when Scandinavian shipbuilders first added sails to their vessels, because sails made of wool or linen rarely survive in the archaeological record. But we know that by the time of the first recorded Viking raids in the late 8th century, their ships were equipped with large square sails woven from wool and reinforced with leather strips. The sail changed everything. Suddenly, a crew could travel hundreds of miles without exhausting themselves at the oars. They could strike quickly, retreat before defenders, could organize and return home laden with plunder before winter storms made the seas impassable. The classic Viking longship that emerged in the 9th century was a masterpiece of naval architecture. The largest warships, called drekars or dragon ships, could be 30 meters long and carry crews of 60 to 80 men. They were fast, capable of speeds up to 15 knots under sail, and they were versatile, equally at home on the high seas or in rivers barely a meter deep. The secret was in the construction. Every plank, every rib, every detail was designed to create a vessel that was both strong and flexible. The keel was carved from a single oak tree, providing the backbone of the ship. The planks were fastened to the ribs with spruce roots that allowed the hull to flex and twist as it rode over waves. This flexibility was crucial. It meant the ship could absorb the punishment of Atlantic storms without breaking apart. Archaeological discoveries have revealed just how sophisticated Viking shipbuilding was. The Gokstad ship, excavated from a burial mound in Norway in 1880, is one of the best preserved Viking vessels ever found, built around 890 AD. It is 23 meters long and could carry a crew of 70 men. When researchers built a replica in 1893 and sailed it across the Atlantic to the Chicago World's Fair, they proved that the design was capable of oceanic voyages. The replica made the crossing in just 28 days, reaching speeds of 11 knots and handling rough seas with ease. The crew reported that the ship was remarkably seaworthy, riding over waves rather than plowing through them. The construction of a longship required enormous resources and skilled labor. A large warship might require 20 oak trees just for the keel and planking, not to mention the hundreds of smaller trees needed for ribs, oars, and masts. The trees had to be carefully selected, old-growth oaks with straight trunks, and the wood had to be split rather than sawn to preserve the strength of the grain. The iron rivets that held the planks together had to be forged by hand, thousands of them for a single ship. The sail required the wool of 200 sheep and hundreds of hours of weaving by skilled women. Only a wealthy chieftain could afford to build and maintain such a vessel, and ownership of a longship was a mark of power and prestige. The shallow draft of the longship was perhaps its most important tactical advantage, while other ships of the period required deep water ports. Viking vessels could beach directly on any shore. Their crews could leap out, drag the ship onto the sand, raid a coastal settlement, and be gone before defenders arrived. They could navigate rivers that other ships couldn't touch, sailing hundreds of miles inland to strike at the heart of kingdoms. The Seine, the Loire, the Thames, the Rhine, the Volga. Viking longships penetrated them all. In 885, a fleet of 700 Viking ships sailed up the Seine and laid siege to Paris. The Franks had never imagined that enemy ships could reach so far into their territory. The longship also enabled the Viking expansion across the North Atlantic. Without these vessels, the settlement of Iceland, Greenland, and North America would have been impossible. The journey from Norway to Iceland was 900 miles of open ocean, with no landmarks and frequent storms. Yet beginning in the 870s, thousands of Norse settlers made the crossing in open boats loaded with families' livestock, tools, and supplies. They navigated by observing the sun, stars, birds, and sea conditions, relying on centuries of accumulated knowledge, passed down through generations of seafarers. The settlers brought their entire world with them in their ships: dismantled houses, horses, cattle, sheep, pigs, chickens, and everything needed to establish farms in a new land. The Oseberg ship, discovered in another Norwegian burial mound in 1904, shows that longships were not just instruments of war, but also works of art built around 820 AD. The Oseberg ship is smaller than the great warships, but it is elaborately decorated with intricate carvings of intertwined animals and serpents. The prow and stern posts are carved into elegant spirals, and the ship was clearly built for a person of high status. It was used as a burial chamber for two women, one probably a queen or priestess, along with a wealth of grave goods, including wagons, sledges, and textiles. The Oseberg ship demonstrates that these vessels were central to Norse culture and identity. They were symbols of power, prestige, and connection to the sea. The longship's design influenced naval architecture far beyond Scandinavia. When William the Conqueror invaded England in 1066, his invasion fleet was modeled on Viking designs. The Bayeux Tapestry, which depicts the Norman conquest, shows ships that are virtually identical to Viking longships, with the same clinker construction, high prows, and single square sails. The Normans were themselves descendants of Vikings who had settled in northern France a century earlier, and they retained the shipbuilding traditions of their ancestors. The success of the Norman conquest owed much to the superiority of their ships, which could carry cavalry horses across the English Channel, something no other vessels of the period could do. The military advantages of the longship were not just about speed and maneuverability, they were also about psychological impact. The sight of dragon ships appearing on the horizon, their prows carved into snarling beasts, their shields hung along the rails, struck terror into coastal populations. The Vikings understood the power of fear, and they used their ships as instruments of psychological warfare. The dragon heads could be removed when approaching friendly shores, but when raiders intended to attack, the carved beasts were mounted to intimidate enemies and invoke the protection of the gods. The effect was devastating. Chroniclers across Europe described the horror of seeing Viking sails appear and knowing that death and destruction would follow. The longship also facilitated the Viking trade networks that stretched from Newfoundland to Constantinople. The same ships that carried raiders could carry merchants, and the line between the two was often blurred. A Viking expedition might raid one coast and trade at the next port, depending on the opportunities that presented themselves. The cargo capacity of a longship was substantial. A vessel could carry several tons of goods: furs, amber, walrus, ivory, slaves, silver, all the commodities that flowed through the Viking trade network. The ships that sailed up the Russian rivers to reach the Byzantine Empire and the Arab caliphates were slightly different from the warships, designed more for cargo than speed, but they shared the same basic construction principles. The navigational skills required to sail these ships were extraordinary. Viking seafarers had no compasses, no charts, no instruments beyond simple tools for measuring the sun's angle. Yet they crossed oceans, discovered new lands, and established Trade routes that spanned continents they navigated by dead reckoning, keeping track of speed, direction, and time to estimate their position. They observed the color and temperature of the water, the behavior of birds and whales, the patterns of waves and currents. They could read the sky, predicting weather from cloud formations. And the color of the sunset at night they steered by the stars, particularly the North Star, which remained fixed, while other constellations wheeled overhead. Recent archaeological discoveries have revealed that the Vikings may have had more sophisticated navigational tools than previously believed. A fragment of crystal, found in a shipwreck off the coast of England, may be a sunstone, a calcite crystal, that can locate the sun even through clouds by detecting polarized light. Icelandic sagas mention sunstones, but scholars long dismissed them as myth. Now experimental archaeology has shown that such crystals actually work, allowing navigators to determine the sun's position with remarkable accuracy, even overcast conditions. If the Vikings possessed such tools, it would explain how they could maintain their course during the frequent foggy conditions of the North Atlantic. The construction techniques used to build longships were closely guarded secrets passed down from master shipwrights to their apprentices. There were no written plans, no blueprints. The knowledge existed entirely in the minds and hands of the builders. They worked by eye and experience, shaping each plank to fit perfectly with its neighbors. The process began with selecting the right trees and continued through months of careful work, splitting planks, shaping ribs, forging rivets, weaving sails. Every step required specialized knowledge and skills. Modern attempts to build replica longships using traditional methods have revealed just how difficult the process was, even with modern tools and detailed measurements from archaeological finds. It takes years to construct an accurate replica. The decline of the longship began in the 11th century as European kingdoms developed stronger defenses and more powerful navies. The era of easy raids was over. Coastal settlements built walls and fortifications. Standing armies could respond more quickly to attacks, and shipbuilders in other parts of Europe began to develop vessels that could match or surpass the Viking ships in combat. The cog, a type of cargo vessel developed in northern Europe, had higher sides that made it harder to board, and it could carry more cargo than a longship, making it more economical for trade. The clinker construction technique continued to be used in northern Europe for centuries, but the distinctive long, narrow warship gradually disappeared. The last great Viking fleet sailed in 1066, when Harald Hardrada of Norway invaded England with 300 ships attempting to claim the English throne. He was defeated and killed at the Battle of Stamford Bridge just days before William the Conqueror landed on the south coast with his own Viking descended fleet. The age of the longship as a dominant military technology was over, but its influence on history was permanent. The Viking expansion had created new kingdoms in England, Ireland, Scotland, Russia, and Normandy. The settlements in Iceland and Greenland had extended European civilization into the North Atlantic, and the navigational techniques developed by Viking seafarers would be used by later European explorers who crossed the Atlantic to the Americas. The longship changed history because it gave a relatively small population from the northern edge of Europe the ability to project power across vast distances at a time when most warfare was local, and most people never traveled more than a few miles from their birthplace. The Vikings could appear anywhere, strike quickly, and vanish before effective resistance could be organized. This mobility allowed them to exploit the weaknesses of larger, richer kingdoms, and to establish themselves as rulers, traders, and settlers across half of Europe. The longship was the key to Viking success, and without it, the medieval world would have developed very differently. Today, Viking longships continue to capture the imagination. Museums across Scandinavia display preserved vessels and replicas. Enthusiasts build and sail reconstructed longships, testing the capabilities of these ancient designs. The longship has become a symbol of adventure, exploration, and the human drive to push beyond known boundaries. When we look at these elegant, deadly vessels, we see not just the technology that enabled the Viking age, but a testament to the ingenuity and ambition of medieval shipbuilders who created something that changed the world. The longship was more than transportation. It was the instrument that allowed a northern people to write their names in history across 3 continents and 2 oceans.